podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, one of the world's leading international professional bodies, which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide.
I'm one of your hosts, Christian van Nieuwerburgh, Professor of Coaching and Positive Psychology at the Center for Positive Health Sciences at RCSI, and I'm very interested in the integration of coaching and positive psychology.
And I'm Paula Nacif, Wellbeing Coach and Researcher and Senior Lecturer at the Masters of Positive Psychology and Coaching Psychology at the University of East London.
We are delighted to bring you this 7-part series exploring the similarities and differences between coaching for well-being and health coaching.
These terms are often used interchangeably, but this series suggests they represent very distinct practices.
We have lined up some incredible guests who share their insights, ideas, and experiences in health and well-being contexts.
We aim to provide answers and understanding on this fascinating and important area of coaching and many more questions.
So, Anna, here we are. How exciting to be here on this Association for Coaching podcast series, especially with you, to talk about a topic I know we're both passionate about, coaching for health and well-being.
It's great to be here. As you know, it's such an important topic. We work with coaching for health and well-being every day, and there are loads more people interested in this topic. And I hope that this podcast series will be food for thought for a lot of coaching practitioners out there.
Yeah, so we're really excited to be speaking with all of you. I think, Anna, if I remember correctly, it's probably a decade ago that we started actually talking about specifically coaching for health. Is that your memory too?
Yes. I think I got involved with coaching for well-being a little bit before that. I think it's been nearly 20 years now, but There wasn't much written about it. There was a lot on coaching for health, but not so much coaching for well-being. Coaching for well-being has been a topic that has the interest in health and coaching for well-being has increased. I think since the pandemic, there's been a shift as well, because we see a lot of people talking about coaching for well-being in communities, in organizations, in health and social care, and in education. So there is a lot of interest out there. I think we realized from the pandemic the importance of well-being across the whole spectrum.
Yeah, so maybe that's an interesting topic for us to kick off with, for us just to explore the relationship between coaching for health and coaching for well-being. I know you've written an academic paper on this topic as well. So do you want to just kick us off with how do you see the relationship between coaching for well-being and coaching for health?
I think it's really important for us to think about how the two areas intertwine. You can't talk about health without talking about well-being, or talking about well-being without considering people's health. But in terms of coaching, there is a difference. When we think about coaching for health, we usually think about coaching that is specifically focused on helping people to manage long-term physical or mental health conditions. So we're looking at for the health markers in there. So for example, if people have high blood pressure and they go to seek coaching for their health, the coach will be thinking about their health, their eating and exercise. There's a lot of lifestyle medicine involved in that coaching for health. And the focus is actually improving that person's health. Whereas when we think about well-being, it's a much wider umbrella, and it's a really complex one, because well-being, even when you say well-being, what does a well-being mean?
Yeah,
it means different things for different people. And even in terms of academic definition, you find probably a few dozen of definition for well-being. And usually we think about well-being in a much wider sense, in a much more holistic sense. And health then becomes part of that well-being. But coaching for well-being, looking at people's quality of life, life satisfaction, values, meaning, how they are flourishing in a much more holistic way, looking at all the different aspects of their lives, not just health. So the focus of coaching for well-being is really people's lives in general, and thinking about all these different aspects.
You know, as we were just talking about, I agree with you that the pandemic, ironically, has raised awareness and increased interest in the use of coaching to support these things. But the other area I would add is the more recent integration of positive psychology with coaching. And as I listened to you, thinking of positive psychology as the science of well-being, really highlighting the role of well-being as part of general thriving. So for me, the integration of coaching and positive psychology also has added something to our discussion. And I wonder whether, and we're not going to reach final conclusions in this podcast or even in this podcast series. We're raising questions, but one possibility is that we consider coaching for well-being to be maybe the umbrella, the larger term, and that we consider health coaching or coaching for health to be one aspect of coaching for well-being. Does that fit with your thinking too?
Yes, it does. I do think that. And I think it's important for those of us working in coaching to try to understand some of our practice. And that's why this series is so important to me personally, because as you said, it's an invitation for more thinking. It's not that we have all the answers, but we're inviting people to think about these things. And one of the things that comes up for me when I think about coaching for health, there are many self-management programs in this country, in other countries, and self-management programs are for people with long-term health conditions. And sometimes I think when we focus on the health and the health markers that we do when we do coaching for health, we might need and think about stepping back a little bit and look at the person a little bit more holistic, that whole of the well-being. Because sometimes we're focused on the health, but the things which are barriers to people well-being are outside the health remit. You mentioned positive psychology. I think it's right. There is so much that we can borrow from positive psychology. So some of the things we know that helps people well-being, relationships is really important, meaning, value, purpose, all of those things that when you're doing coaching for health, perhaps we're not thinking about those things, but those things are really important for the person in front of us as well, because they might be the barriers why someone is not actually doing the things they need to do for their health. I've worked with people in long-term conditions for a very long time, doing coaching for well-being. So I'm always thinking about what is the bigger picture here that is informing this person's experiences of their well-being. Not to mention some of the societal components of that experience, whether people have employment, where they live, their work situation, whether they enjoy their work or not, whether they have good relationships or not. All of those things are so important. And I think coaching for well-being then enables us to address all of those different areas. I think it really helps people take a step back and think about their well-being in all of those different ways and using all of those different components of well-being.
Yeah. So what would be then the argument for distinguishing them? And I think we should. That's why I'm asking. I do think there is a need for us where we are as a profession at the moment to set apart coaching for health. And specifically, I think it's good for us to connect it to a definition. We've talked about physical and mental health. We're saying that kind of coaching, maybe it falls under the umbrella of well-being, but we see it as separate. What are your views on that? I have a few thoughts I'd like to share as well once you've shared.
I think it's important for us to separate our practice in order to inform the people we're working with what it is that we're doing.
Yeah.
I think from a health perspective, and I know that you're very passionate of positive health and you'll be talking more about that with us here today. But I think from a health perspective, it's important that our clients know the focus of the work. And if the focus of the work is coaching for health and there is a real defined outcome that is needed for that coaching, that when I go and work with you, if you're my health coach, that I know that that's what we're going to be doing.
Yeah.
I think a scope of practice boundaries, I think is ethical, because then we understand what we're here to do together and what the expectations are from you as a coach, from me as a client, and the really defined focus on health. Whereas well-being, you can think about coaching for well-being in all different settings as well. And I think that's the beauty of it. You take coaching for well-being to organizations, to communities, to schools, because of the umbrella, and it's much wider. What are your thoughts? What do you think in terms of separating those two practices?
I agree with you. I think right now there is a need for us to have some boundaries, like you said. And we're going to be having a panel discussion about ethics because I do think that's one important reason. And I'm cautious that by creating very rigid boundaries, we're going to lose some of the nuance that you talked about, which I like, which is to say, if we're saying, look, we're coaching for physical and mental health, it doesn't mean that's it. We don't talk about well-being for sure. So I think there's a need for us to think about how do these sit alongside each other. And temporarily, I like the idea that coaching for well-being can incorporate lots of different interventions, and that we're saying right now that maybe it's helpful for us to distinguish health coaching, and I'll say a little bit more about positive health coaching in a moment, And while we're talking about all the ways these things connect, and there's many ways, which is why these conversations, I think, are going to be rich. Another way that I think this is important is to acknowledge that some of the research into the effectiveness of coaching practice hints at the idea that any coaching is good for one's well-being. In other words, even executive coaching, it's happening in an organization. Maybe you're talking about a restructuring that's happening, but the process itself and the trust and the relationship that builds, that is actually good for the client's well-being as well as your own. So again, I want to note that, but say that for me, that's not coaching for well-being. And for me, coaching for well-being is the main purpose of the interaction is to enhance well-being, thriving, flourishing. And like you say, well-being can include wanting to be more joyful, have more balance in one's life, be clearer about one's meaning, be more aligned to one's values. So really, well-being is very broad and necessary. And within that, coaching for health perhaps is a subcategory, but it's something I guess we'll continue to explore. What are your thoughts, Anna, about why coaching specifically is a good intervention in this arena of health and well-being?
That's a great question, Christian. There are so many reasons why coaching can be so helpful for people in health and well-being. And you mentioned organizations. I just want to think a little bit about the role of coaching for well-being within organizations and helping people be well at work. And such an important part, because we all have a life. Life gets in the way. We're all dealing with adversities outside of work. Sometimes we are experiencing challenges, and sometimes we just want to do more for our own well-being and flourish and enjoy life more. And the balance that you mentioned, I quite like the work-life integration rather than moving things around in compartments, but it's like work is part of life. Life becomes part of work and all of that. So coaching for well-being organizations is really important. We all biased, aren't we, Christian? Because we love coaching. We've been doing this forever and we're very fond of what we do. And I think some of the key things about coaching being the right intervention or the right tool for well-being is really giving people the ability to think for themselves and giving them agency, autonomy, supporting people to explore some of their perspectives on life. So you mentioned positive psychology. We know, for example, that the third wave positive psychology really focused on meaning, on values, and coaching for well-being. It gives people that tool. Well, let's step back and explore. How is it that we want to live our lives? How do we want to spend our time? What do we put in our time that will be supportive and conducive to our well-being? What are the ingredients? All of us, that we're all different. And coaching helps us think about what is it that I want in my life that will be supportive of my well-being? How do I want to spend my time and energy? Do I feel agency and energized to do those things as well? Because sometimes we want things, but we not necessarily feel energized with the doing of those things. And coaching helps clients to figure those things out. And there is a partnership there between the coach and the client as well. You know, someone walking alongside you, creating space for you to have those reflections, perhaps creating space for people to get out of themselves and look at themselves from a different perspective and make sense of what is it that's important to them, what is it that they want, and try to potentially separate some of the stories that we've been telling ourselves our whole lives, or what society tells us that we should do, should not do, should want, should not want, should value, should not value. There are so many messages, especially in this day and age of social media. I wonder what you think about that. We're bombarded with messages about well-being and health constantly, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. I agree with everything you've said. And there's so many things in there, aren't there? It's just so many reasons why coaching is a helpful intervention in this space. And yes, maybe we're biased, but I think we're biased because we've seen it work. And that's the advantage of us having worked in this sector for many years, I think, is we've seen in real time. And you're right, this idea of raising awareness. We create safe spaces where people can maybe take a step back from their lives and maybe see what's going on. It does promote agency, but also, I think really importantly, Anna, personal responsibility. And I think we as organizations, health organizations, but also societies, I think we would benefit if people took more personal responsibility for their own health and well-being. So it does that. The other advantage of coaching is it's highly, highly personalized. And it's all about context, isn't it? Coaching is all about helping people understand their own context, adapting interventions to their own context. And finally, for me, coaching is a really respectful intervention. There's a big difference, I think, between telling somebody what they need to do to be healthy and, like you use the term, partnership, having a dialogue with somebody about their health and well-being feels qualitatively different as a type of conversation. And I think the outcomes can be spectacularly different if we approach clients with a telling mentality of this is what you need to do, the prescriptive model, and the partnering way of working with them, like you suggested. The reason I'm excited is I think the outcomes could be very positive if we can incorporate more of a, maybe a coaching mindset. I'm not arguing there should always be coaching, but just adopting that coaching mindset of how we can support people, I think, is helpful. And, one of my recent books that I wrote with Robert Biswas-Diener called Radical Listening, one of our arguments is that listening itself is an intervention that can strengthen relationships, that can make people feel seen, valued, and heard. And anybody who works in the health setting will know what I mean when I say sometimes people just need to be listened to. And that is part of the healing process. That's part of the well-being enhancement process. So I can see so many ways that coaching is a helpful intervention within health settings. What about you, Anna?
I totally agree. I think as human beings, we crave connection, don't we? We crave being seen and being heard by others. I love the word respectfully. It really is what we do as coaches. We sit there with someone with a full intention of actually seeing this person, understanding this person and supporting this person. And I think that in itself is the intervention. I agree that with the listening.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting the impact that being seen can have.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking in particular, because as you know, I work across the spectrum of different industries, working organizations, but also I do a lot of work in communities. And that made me think about some of the people who are not heard. And it might be the first time that someone asks them, what is it that you want? And what your thoughts are? Because depending on their background, you mentioned context, they may have been going from pillar to post with people telling them what to do and having the solutions on their behalf. And I think that listening to someone is so important. And the other thing that you mentioned there, personal responsibility, for me, in some context, is the balance between recognizing, helping people and supporting them in understanding that they can have agency. Some of the research I did, a lot of realization from clients, yes, I have a choice. Yes, I can do things differently. It was something that they had not contemplated before, but they realized that they could have that agency and that choice, and recognizing the context in which they live and some of the challenges. One of the things I worry about sometimes is that we blame people for the circumstances in which they're in terms of health and well-being. Oh, you don't eat well because you don't want to, or you don't exercise, you can just go for a walk. Those kind of assumptions, and I think it can stigmatize people. So that balance between personal responsibility and understanding the context of someone. And that is what we do. We sit with the person, tell me about you and your life and how you experience your life, rather than sit with me and I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to do to feel better. And I think we're changing the model of health. If you think about health settings as well, the medical model is highly hierarchical, right?
Yes.
It's still doctors and even people going to the doctor to tell me what to do to get better. So we're inviting people to think differently. And I think we're inviting professionals to think differently as well, especially in some settings, health, social care, education, to think that they can have a conversation with someone that is an alliance. Yes, they have knowledge. And then I will invite you to talk about positive health, because I think that kind of touching upon positive health, because sometimes the professionals have a knowledge that might be helpful to the person in front of them. So what do you think, Christian, is the balance then between people will be asking, what if I have knowledge? Do I tell my clients about their knowledge? Do I share their knowledge? And then am I being directive? Is this coaching? Is this something else?
Exactly. And I think, in our conversation just now, Anna, we've made a compelling case that coaching has a place within the health settings for the reasons that you've just highlighted. And as you were talking, I also was thinking the difference between a telling model, a prescriptive model, and a partnership model is that if a patient goes to a health professional and they're told what to do and they do it, they are going to get better. So I don't want to undermine that. That's definitely the case. But if we add the idea of partnership, not only are they going to get better, they're going to build self-confidence, like you said. So the risk of a telling model is that we create this learned helplessness of, like you said, I go to the doctor and I say, something's wrong with me. I don't know what to do. Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. I might do it and I might get better, but bringing a coaching approach increases the chances of me getting additional long-term, like life lessons of, if I participate more fully in my own well-being, it feels good for me and I make progress and it shows me that I have agency. So there's so many advantages. And you're right. And when I work at the University of Medicine and Health Sciences, RCSI, and so the question you've raised is a really important one for us. And in fact, where I work, the Center for Positive Health Sciences, we run a master's called Positive Health Coaching. So I just want to say a little bit about positive health coaching, and then I'd love to hear your perspective on that. In positive health coaching, we argue that it's still a facilitative approach overall. The purpose is to facilitate. The approach we take is partnering. But we would say that it's a dialogic coaching approach. Now, that means that it's a dialogue. And we would argue that in a dialogue, both people participate roughly equally. And that means, yes, the positive health coach has information that would be helpful. So let's use the example of somebody who's got some back pain. And they're going to a positive health coach, and this client wants to do something because the pain is excruciating at home, it's having an impact on their work life. And we wouldn't take the facilitative approach of saying, well, what do you think you should do? And what ideas have you got? And what might somebody else do? Because it seems, and I'm going to say something a bit radical here, it seems unethical to have information that might be of help to a client's health and well-being and not share it. And that's going to be an experience that many coaches in the health sector and health professionals will experience. So we're very clear that in positive health coaching, the positive health coach can share information. And the information they share is important: evidence-based information, research-informed information, best practice that's agreed by recognized and credible health bodies. That's the kind of information that a positive health coach would share. And the way they share it is just by saying, here is what those professional bodies or best practice or evidence says. Here's a few things. And so the process, let me just give a little sketch of what a typical positive health coaching conversation would be. The first stage is the positive health coach, like you say, very explicit. My role is to support you with something you want to do to enhance, improve your health. That's the context. Then we would start with the discovery phase. So we start with the positive health coach would say to the client, tell me about you, tell me what's going on for you. And crucially, they might ask something like, what is your attitude to your own health and well-being? So just to get a kind of a raise awareness about that. And then we go into the desired outcome. So what is it you'd like? And in the example I gave, person would be like, look, I've got this back pain. What I'd like is to be able to manage it so it doesn't get in the way of me spending time with my grandchildren and it doesn't irritate me when I'm at work, something like that. But we would switch it to something positive, a toward goal. What is it you want? I want to go into work feeling X, Y, and Z, or I want to spend time with my grandchildren in this way. And then from outcomes, then we go to pathways. But to give our listeners an example of what we mean by dialogue, it would still start with the coach saying, what have you thought about? What have you already tried? What advice have you received? What has ChatGPT told you? What has your GP said to you in the past? We want to gather what is the information that they have about this before the positive health coach would then say, well, this is what's known about the kind of condition you have. And they would simply share it. And then once that's shared, then the next part is to talk about context. So we think about the pathways. The client chooses the pathway that they think is most helpful from the ones shared from the positive health coach, or the ones they brought with them, because this is still about giving the client choice and agency. But then they would think about how does that pathway, that intervention, that cure, that process, how is it going to work in my context? And you alluded to that, Anna. Where you live really might impact what's available to you. And if somebody's saying, oh, well, it would be nice to go swimming in the gym every whatever, well, maybe I don't have a gym with a swimming pool that's close by. So context is important. Who else around you would support you, that kind of thing. And then the final stage of the conversation is one that we call co-design. And again, this is slightly different from purely facilitative coaching because the coach would be involved in co-designing with the client the intervention that the client is going to take. And then the phrase we use, the term we use for what happens in between coaching conversations is experimentation. Because now what we want the client to do is take this new learning and put it into practice, but in an experimental way to learn, because they might have to adapt it. The context may or may not be suitable. They may or may not be motivated to do it. So we really want to foster that idea of I'm experimenting, I'm taking control of this. If it works, I'm going to do more of it. If it doesn't work, we're going to refine it. So that's in a nutshell, positive health coaching. And I think it respects both the knowledge that our health professionals have. They have expertise that is helpful to their clients. And it also respects the agency of clients and so-called patients, because they deserve to be treated in that respectful way that we've talked about. So now that I've described it, what kind of questions, thoughts, or reflections do you have, Anna?
You've done really well, Christian, in walk us through all these different aspects of positive health coaching. What comes to my mind is questions around, for coaches, the scope of practice, so that we understand, and that's why we're having this conversation, inviting people to think about coaching for health, coaching for well-being, positive health coaching, because you're talking about professionals with knowledge, you're talking about evidence-based practice. So it's not like, oh, I saw on YouTube yesterday, someone said that doing 3 squats is good for my back, and I'm telling my client to go online. And so I think this is really important, that professional and ethical approach. So for those coaches who will be working in that area, and it's the same sometimes in terms of health coaching with long-term health conditions, that the coach has knowledge of that particular long-term health condition that they want to share, that we really thinking about evidence-based practice and the scope of practice, especially when there is so much out there that is misleading or not based on evidence in the coaching industry included. We hear things that we go, I take a deep breath and think, where does that come from? You know, all the kind of myths around health or neuroscience or whatever topic is the flavor of the day that you think this has no basis, is just, you know, and sometimes it's factually wrong as well. So I think that's an important point.
Yeah.
And I think, as you said, it's important that professionals can use their knowledge
Exactly.
to support people. And I love the idea that there's still an offer, and let's go and experiment, try it out, see if it works, what doesn't work, come back, and we still fine tuning together what might work for you. So it's not like telling the client what to do, it's offering a menu of options which we know have been researched and based on evidence, and then let the client think about this. And I think in a way there is a similarity of that and positive psychology. So as you know, I teach at the University of East London in the Masters for Positive Psychology and Coaching Psychology. And sometimes students ask me, it's like, oh, we have all this knowledge about positive psychology, and if we use a positive psychology intervention, are we directing the client? Is this still coaching? When do I share something I know? Or should I share something I know about well-being in general? Because as you said, positive psychology is the science of well-being. There are so many things that we know enhances people's well-being. But I think there is a difference between telling them, do this because research tells us that it's good for your well-being, and having a conversation and sharing things. I am an information sharer at the best. I love sharing information, but I usually do very tentatively. And in terms of coaching for well-being, is sharing information and see how it lands with the client and whether they want to pick up or not. So it's less structured than the process that you described in positive health coaching. I think we have a duty as well. You know, you don't coach people to a bus stop. You say, turn right, left, that's the bus stop. If you know about something, as you said, it wouldn't be ethical to withhold that information.
Yeah.
What the client does with that information, then they're free to choose then onwards, and you won't be kind of forcing them down a particular path. But there is so much goodness in settings where people are taking their time to understand science or health and well-being. And we need to use that knowledge in partnership with our clients. I really like that.
Thanks, Anna. A couple of things that have come up in what you've said. So first of all, I think codes of ethics would say, and that applies for coaches, but also positive psychology practitioners, do no harm is kind of the fundamental ethical code for our practitioners. And that includes health professionals. So we're all bound by that. So I do think there's a risk in sharing information about something that's outside, let's use that phrase, scope of practice. So I want to give you a lived example. In my case, I would say I was coaching for well-being. My client was talking to me about, wanting to live a life which felt more energizing and fulfilling for them. And so this was maybe the third session, and my client started talking about their eating habits, what they would eat and experiences they had when they were younger with food. And as we were talking, it was clear that there was an eating disorder. And the outcome of the coaching conversation was, well, what should I do about that? And the client wanted to come up with something to do. I don't know. I can't help people with eating disorders. So that was a perfect example for me of referring my client. And I referred my client to an expert who would have the necessary medical or health information to support them. So for me, this is coming back to our initial reason for why do we want to distinguish this? Because I feel very competent to coach people around their well-being in general terms. But if it comes down to particular health, and that applies to physical, but also mental health, and I know we're going to be having another podcast around the mental health aspect. So that's one example I wanted to share. But I also want to share with you kind of the ideal example. If you were to say, well, how is this positive health coaching going to work? What's the big idea behind it? Because there's already health coaches out there and they're doing an amazing job. In the United States, you can become a board accredited health coach. So there's health coaches out there. But for me, the ideal position for positive health coaches is after a patient has been to see their GP or a consultant or a psychiatrist, and they've had medical information that tells them that they need to change their behavior. So the starting point would be that the patient themselves is committed to engage in trying to bring about more positive health-related behavior. So that's the starting point. My hope is that there will be some kind of referral system. So let's imagine a general practitioner or a doctor. They say to the person, well, if you really want to lose weight, or maybe the GP would say, you need to lose weight. And if you really want to lose weight and you're willing to commit to it, I can refer you. So that's the ideal scenario for me. Then they would refer them to somebody who knows about weight loss, a positive health coach. And then the client goes there already wanting to make a change. And then we get into the dialogic process that we talked about. I think it could take some pressure off our health systems for there to be somewhere to refer to. And based on our knowledge of what leads to effective coaching, that idea you already mentioned, choice is essential. It shouldn't be, I'm going to refer you to a positive health coach because you must do X, Y, and Z. It's really saying, if you're committed to changing, there's a resource out there. These people are trained in supporting you to embrace new positive health behaviors. So I'm going to refer you to a positive health coach who knows all about nutrition, etc. So that's kind of my vision for it. What do you think?
I love your vision. And I also have a dream. We can dream together, Christian, because it's quite similar. Yes. Because as you described the nutrition part of it or the exercise or whatever it is that someone has an expertise on, I'm also thinking there is a lot of people who end up in general practice because they are not flourishing, they are languishing. And then they feel unwell. And of course, as we know, our mental, physical health are all intertwined with human beings. We function integratively, if you like. And there is something that we do in the United Kingdom called social prescribing, is where general practice sends people to local charities and local projects to see if they engage a little bit more. So they're using pretty much the principles of well-being theories and positive psychology to say, actually, there might be things that this person can do to improve their sense of well-being And that's where coaching for wellbeing comes to, because I can see the positive health coach working alongside wellbeing coaches,
Yes.
where wellbeing coaches will be focusing on the holistic aspect of things. It's like, sometimes people are feeling lonely. They want connection. And some other times that they need some energy in their lives. They need to reconnect with their purpose. They need to reconnect with friends and family, whatever might be going on. And I think that coaching for wellbeing will help clients have that discussion, then find the pathway that you're talking about. What can I do to help myself and improve and go from languishing to flourishing? Or even if it's in the middle of that scale, or that I can just feel better about myself. There's nothing necessarily medically wrong with me, but I don't feel quite right. And everyone who has languished in the past, and I believe all of us have, because we're humans, we've experienced a range of human experiences, and there is no medication necessarily for that. Unfortunately, that's what sometimes happens in the medical care, that people go and they're languishing and they go away with an antidepressant or something like that, which I think is really problematic. But sometimes we experiencing that languishing and we need support and help to actually figure out what are the paths that I could take to help myself and feel better. And we recognize as coaches, but also medical professionals, that it's not always linked to a physical issue that needs to be medicated for. And I think that is the thing. I think about getting into flow, a hobby, doing something, thinking about our values, doing something meaningful, contributing to our community and so on. All the things that we know from the science of well-being that are supportive. So I think we could create that together and have all these people working in communities, because that's where general practice lives. And also I think secondary care and hospitals. I think we don't have that culture in the UK. I think there's difference in between countries as well, how they approach coaching for health and well-being. But what a wonderful world it would be if people have access to those conversations. And you said the conversation in itself is healing. People being seen and heard.
Yeah, what a wonderful conversation we've had. I think it's been wonderful. And thinking about our listeners and the profession of coaching, represented by Association for Coaching, it makes me think that our contribution to this is to prepare ourselves to be able to support the kind of vision we've talked about. Because if this were to happen, and what a wonderful world it would be, then there's going to be a need for people who are appropriately trained. And I think that's something we're both saying, is that the training is really important because we're dealing with people's health and well-being. And so looking ahead to our future podcasts, we're going to be talking about coaching and mental health. There's a panel where we're going to be talking about ethics, because we've touched a little bit on that, haven't we, Anna? There's going to be some ethical questions considered with people who have a lot to share about that. And then something that we haven't touched on yet, but I know Anna and I, we both think of this as very important, is the health and well-being of the health professional or the coach. So that'll be another topic that we'll be exploring in a future podcast. Anna, it's been wonderful talking to you. And I've actually learned so much just by having the opportunity for us to share ideas and articulate different parts of this. And I hope that our listeners have also taken away some insights, some questions that will help them in what it is they do.
Thank you, Christian. It's been really great to be here with you today and learn more about positive health coaching and also asking those questions, right? I think that's what we can do as practitioners and coaches and positive psychology practitioners out there. What questions do we need to ask ourselves? And yes, I look forward to the next one. Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching.
For over 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society.
To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or visit our webpage at associationforcoaching.com.
Explore our digital learning hub and enjoy our extensive library of on-demand webinars, interviews, podcasts, and a portfolio of live events for your continuing professional development.